Good afternoon and welcome to the Fraud Engagement from A to Z webinar. My name is Sam BowerCraft and I'm here with Dave Hammarberg, and we're glad to welcome you to today's webinar on fraud engagements and how they work. Say hello, Dave.
Good afternoon.
As we go through this, feel free to post questions using the input on the web interface there, and we'll try to answer them during the webinar and our content, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So with that, a little bit more about us. As I mentioned, my name is Sam BowerCraft. I'm a senior manager with McKonly Asbury. I've been with the firm for a little over 7.5 years. My background originally is in engineering, and I moved into the information technology field for about 7 years. And then I moved into finance, so I probably have one of the geekiest backgrounds of most people that I know. And now I do risk management and controls work for McKonly and our clients, as well as some fraud investigation and assistance with data analysis, risk management, and strategic planning, and helping our clients with processes and controls. Dave has a similar experience and skill set, as well as some other stuff. Dave, you want to tell our viewers about you?
Yes. As Sam mentioned, my name is Dave Hammarberg. My official title at M&A is Director of IT and Senior Manager of our Consulting Division. I have various accounting and fraud certifications, as well as some IT certifications that help me or enable me to provide some sound fraud investigations for our clients. I have been conducting those fraud engagements for about 11 years now. Those fraud engagements range from local governments to animal shelters to large corporations. I've also had the experience of being on both sides of a criminal case, both the prosecution and defense. So wide experience.
Yes, and I can vouch for Dave. He has 11 years of experience in this field, but he's actually only 25. So, from that perspective, he's still got a long career ahead of him in this field. And I should also note that while Dave has a lot of experience in fraud, it's actually fraud investigation and not committing fraud himself. Is that correct, Dave?
Thanks for pointing that out, Sam.
I just wanted to clarify.
Little about McKonly and Asbury. We're a regional CPA firm. Our main areas are audit, tax, risk management. We have 3 locations. Our main location's in Camp Hill. We also have a location in Lancaster, as well as Allentown. We have a variety of clients, just as our range of fraud investigations, our range is wide. We have large construction, manufacturing, nonprofits, the gamut of different clients. And the fourth point there, we do have spatial capabilities in the risk management, internal controls area. And the last point there is it's a great place to work.
It is a great place to work. And to speak to that fourth point briefly, we'll talk about it more throughout the presentation, but the risk management and controls, as you'll soon see, is exceptionally important when we talk about fraud prevention and what happens during a fraud investigation, as well as things that we look at.
That's correct, Sam. I mean, it's real important to have internal controls. Fraud investigation is sort of a waste of money if you don't have internal controls in the first place, so good point.
Yeah.
Brief overview of what you can expect from this presentation, besides maybe a few corny jokes from Sam. We'll walk through a fraud engagement, as you can see there, from A to Z. This is sort of the steps we go through. Now, each engagement is going to be slightly or a lot different, but for the most part, each one of our fraud engagements includes these steps. They may include more, but usually they include all of these. Each one of these steps will discuss what happens during that stage, what you as the company has to consider moving forward or your next step, and what you may want to consider now, ranging from internal controls to just steps you want to put in place.
And to add on to that, Dave, these steps are iterative, so you may, while we have them in a linear fashion here for demonstration purposes, you may jump between steps and go from step 2 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 3 to 4 and back again during the process of a fraud engagement.
And that all depends on, of course, your industry, as well as a big part of this is what your insurance company dictates. So different steps we suggest may change at different times.
Exactly. Additionally, we have a little disclaimer there. And the purpose of the disclaimer is to make sure that you understand that we're not going to cover everything in complete detail. This is not a replacement for professional advice or speaking to us about specific circumstances or incidents. We do have a 16-week class that you can sign up for, and as soon as we get 10 members for that class, we'll start developing it and put it together.
You'll find that this presentation differs a lot from a normal fraud presentation where you go and you hear a lot of stories and you walk away sometimes thinking it's a great presentation but no action steps. So we're hoping from this presentation you go away with steps that if there was an engagement that you could take some steps and move forward with it. So nothing against the other presentations, but hopefully this will be a little bit more hands-on experience.
Yeah, and give you some things to consider. I agree. With that being said, let's move on to step one. Pretty much every fraud engagement that we experience and deal with starts with a company or client noticing something that either makes them think that fraud may be occurring, or they notice that fraud is actually occurring, and they come to us for a variety of reasons. So we're going to cover some of those reasons and some of the considerations around each of the events that may trigger a fraud investigation. And as we're going through this presentation, let us take a moment. We have quite a few slides in here, and we may not touch on every slide specifically, but we will be touching on each of the steps, and you can always come back and re-listen to the webinar and look at the different slides. Each slide will have additional detail, and we may get to some of the detail and we may not, but it is there for your review later, and hopefully you can leverage it in some way within your organization.
Good point, Sam. The next couple of slides will be on our step one, suspicion. I listed here when making the slides 4 different events, but again, this is an inclusive list, but it is a list that are more prevalent in my different fraud engagements that I've done. The first one, the first slide, whistleblower. Whistleblower could be a hotline for a larger corporation, or it could just be an employee talking to management that something is not right. One important aspect to consider with whistleblower is you've got to, before you go to an all-out investigation, you need to consider, is it valid? Who is it coming from? What is the reason that employee is bringing this up? Is it just be a spat between employees? Are they not? You have to consider all those things. And after you consider those, then you have to consider your response.
I agree, Dave. Another thing to note about whistleblower activity is it doesn't always come from your employees. It can come from customers or people outside the company, vendors. There are a variety of areas, and not only do you have to evaluate where the notification is coming from, but also what opportunities do people have to notify the company? Do you have a whistleblower hotline? Do people know who to call or where to contact if they observe inappropriate activity and they need to notify someone in an anonymous fashion?
Exactly, and one other thing to consider is the confidentiality. From having a hotline to just that, if that employee or vendor talks to that management person, that has to be taken as a confidential moment. Or it could impair other employees coming forth in the future with other fraud issues.
Yeah. Additionally there, you see that last bullet point under things to consider, short-term control response. After you receive a phone call about potential inappropriate activity or fraudulent activity, management and whoever receives the phone call should decide whether or not something should be done straight away. Controls should be in place to prevent bad things from happening, but additionally, if there's a notification or a whistleblower activity, it may indicate that either controls aren't being performed or there's a control gap. And management might need to take some immediate action to, plug that hole before additional bad things happen, before they begin an investigation or carry forward with other activities.
The next event we have listed here is auditors, whether they're external or internal. the one problem, or I guess I should say this event, it probably makes number 4th on the list. The problem with audits, especially external audits, is they're planned out. You know, if I'm a fraudster and I'm smart enough to do the fraud, a lot of times I can take steps to hide that from the auditors. Internal and control or internal audits usually probably find a little bit more than I would say external audits, just because a lot more times they're more surprised and they're more ongoing. But it is a way to capture data and capture irregularities that could be fraudulent. Vacation or sickness, that is probably one of my leading events that I get called about. Whether someone, you know, emergency hospital visit, or kid gets sick and they have to be out of the office. Usually it's more than one day. Usually it's about a week, and the employer finds that, you know, they have to do the job for that individual. That's when irregularities pop up. You know, they can't hide all of the things they were doing to hide that fraud. I often think to myself, you know, would it be possible to give an employee, especially one that you consider a good employee, you know, they don't take vacation, they hardly ever get sick, you go up to them and say, hey, you know, take 2 or 3 days off. You know, would that benefit to see any kind of irregularities? I know it's a cost to the company, but it might put a emphasis on some of the irregularities that are happening.
Yeah, exactly, Dave. Frequently we see frauds that are discovered because fraudulent individuals don't have the control they had over concealing the, you know, bad activities that they were performing. And we have items here, and these are well documented. You know, do you require people to take their vacation? Do you do cross-training? And cross-training is sort of a no-brainer for 2 reasons. 1, it helps to prevent fraud, and 2, don't you want more than one employee to know what's going on and how things are done? You know, the infamous beer truck incident, or I like to refer to it as the winning lottery ticket, because I don't like to kill off employees or coworkers. But if you suddenly had a coworker or an employee just leave the company, how much organizational knowledge do they have? And cross-training can be an excellent way to help limit that risk, but also help to limit the risk of fraud.
I agree with you, Sam. That's important and probably a little bit more useful for companies to cross-train as opposed to giving vacation. And the last point there, rotating job responsibilities. I think that, you know, if you give that individual a different job responsibility for a week, that's really going to, unless there's, you know, 2 people working together, that's gonna point to some irregularities if there are some.
Yeah, the phrase that comes to mind is, if you always leave the fox in charge of the hen house, how many chickens do you think you're going to have?
The last one is missing assets, whether it's inventory, whether it's just plain cash missing from the drawer. You just notice something missing, and it's pretty straightforward. And if you haven't already started, I mean, it's a great time to start documenting, and underneath the things to consider, you know, what are the known facts, what are the possible losses, who is involved in the fraud, who's in charge of the situation, and what will be done.
That's right, Dave. And speaking of what will be done, leads us right into step 2, which is really company action. And this really involves the company where the fraud is taking place. You know, the company needs to take action to address the potential fraud. And I say potential fraud because from a litigation standpoint and reputation standpoint, you don't want to accuse anybody or declare someone to be a fraudster or a criminal without appropriate evidence, because it can come back to haunt you. So, you know, with the potential fraud in place, management needs to get together and start talking about what are the known facts, as Dave mentioned. Start writing things down. What do you know? What happened and when? What documentation and evidence is there? Why does it point to the possibility of fraud? What are the possible losses? What's been misplaced or misallocated? Who's involved? Who could have been involved? Who's in charge of the situation? Who's taking responsibility and for managing the investigation, as well as who's responsible for making decisions, and who you're going to clue in on this? Because in some cases you need everybody to know what's going on. In other cases you want to keep it close to the vest until it's time to reveal certain information to certain people in order to best leverage the situation. And making those decisions and navigating that path can be a little tricky sometimes, because hopefully you don't deal with fraudulent situations very frequently. I mean, if you've got this process down, one would hope that it's because either you're a law enforcement agency or you're a certified fraud investigator.
I agree with you, Sam. And one thing I just want to emphasize that you said was, keeping it confidential. A lot of times, a client will come to us and they'll have weak internal controls, but the fraudster doesn't know that that it's been found out. So in those situations, we can use that to our benefit and kind of put controls into place to document the fraud as it's going on. So we may not have history, but we've got current information. So the need to know for those key employees, whether it's HR, legal, and senior management, you've got to keep that confidential.
Additional areas to consider as far as keeping information confidential or sharing it. The next slide here, deciding when and if you're going to contact the police is another aspect of any fraudulent situation. Contacting the police has its own implications. Once you contact the police and you issue a report, you file a report, their public knowledge becomes, it comes into play. The police are going to want to know a lot of information. They're not necessarily always as well informed regarding financial fraudulent situations. So in some cases, or in a lot of cases, you need to educate them on what's going on, why you think it's a criminal act. They're going to want to know lots of facts that you might have to educate them. They want to know if you're going to prosecute or not. If you're not going to prosecute, then you should just reconsider what you're going to do with regard to the police.
We always recommend that the police be contacted and a report be filed for a fraudulent activity. We realize there are reasons that companies don't want to do that, but for one thing to consider is white-collar crimes oftentimes fall to the bottom of the list for the police. So a fraud investigation could go 5 to 6 months because violent crimes are going to take place and the police, just can't get to it, whether that's a forensic examination of a computer or any other kind of investigation or just the prosecution of it. You want to get it to the police as soon as possible and get it into their hands. The other item with contacting police is if you don't contact police, that fraudster's, even though you probably let them go, is probably going to do the same thing in the next company. So to prevent that, you may have a moral obligation to report it.
That's exactly right, Dave. And frequently in cases where an individual commits fraud at one company and the company just shuffles them out and they don't want the bad publicity and they don't press charges, that individual is highly likely to recommit a similar fraud at the next company.
And for one reason or another, the nonprofits that I do fraud engagements work with, oftentimes it's reoccurring. Now, I'm not sure if nonprofits feel like they don't have the money to prosecute, etc., but a lot of times it's nonprofits.
And here's where background checks become so important. However, if prosecution doesn't occur, background checks won't help. Now, when it comes to insurance companies, frequently companies have bonding, or individuals are bonded, or companies have insurance protection against fraudulent activity. But it's very important for you to know exactly what the terms of your fraud policy are with regard to your insurance company. In some cases, that policy will only apply if you have certain processes and controls in place, that you have oversight, but additionally, they won't cover your losses if you don't prosecute the individual. So you may become trapped between a rock and a hard place. You don't want necessarily the bad PR, but your insurance policy won't pay out unless you publicize the fact that you had a fraud committed.
Another thing to keep in mind when you contact the insurance company is to ask them what format they want the investigation done in. Usually they want a third party to come in, a CFE, and they want that information or data to prove that fraudulent transactions in a certain format. So they're going to take that format and they have fraud investigators on their side, and they're going to sort of look over that information. If that information's not in the right format, you're going to pay extra to that accounting or third party to get it into that format after the first format's done. So just keep that in mind to do it right for the first time.
Yep.
As mentioned in the previous slide, a third party will be brought in and with a recommendation of your insurance company, not who is recommended, but they're going to recommend that a third party comes in and does a report. And the person that you probably want to seek out is a CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner. They have the education to provide you the necessary steps to continue. That CFE is going to come in or talk to you and give you some steps to look out for, the future steps, and kind of explain where you're at. You're going to tell him the facts, and then he's going to tell you the options and what he thinks going forward. The biggest thing for a CFE at that point in time is kind of gauge the engagement. Tell you, a brief overview of what he expects, what and that CFE at that point in time should be calculating in his mind the cost and working towards an engagement letter. Other things that in that conversation, whether it's a phone conversation or a physical meeting, to discuss is preservation of data. One of the important items to consider is how long is that data going to be on your network? How do you preserve it? How do you make sure it doesn't change? If you have the correct internal controls in place, that data is important to make sure that it stays the same and is preserved. I've had various clients that have, especially with video, after 3 months, 4 months, 3 weeks, the video gets overwritten. Well, that video is sometimes the most important thing we have, depending on internal controls, etc., and it's overwritten. So at that point in time, that moment, you have to figure out that the data, is the data preserved? We're not looking for a bit-to-bit hard drive match. We're looking to make sure that the data is preserved at this point in time. As well as at this point in time, it's a great time for question and answer for the client. A lot of times this is the first time for the client to go through this, so it's your moment to ask questions.
And these discussions usually are a little bit longer at the beginning because a lot of the conversation will sort of be strategic in nature. It will be, well, what do you know? What information do you have? Where do you think this is going to go? And we'll talk about different options, going soup to nuts and investigating everything and getting lots of information, doing some preliminary work and preliminary interviews in order to best address the situation and maximize the outcome for you as the company. Sometimes those conversations are kind of short. The reality is that some companies come to us with situations and our initial recommendation is to improve their processes and controls and tell them that we really can't help them to recover much because they lack documentation and existing processes and controls in order to properly identify and prosecute the individual who may have committed the fraudulent act.
Another item at this point in time is whether you have to discuss whether computer forensics will be involved. A lot of times the police department will have those services. A lot of times you can hire another third-party vendor who probably would come at the recommendation of the CFE. But it's I mentioned earlier that you didn't want to do a bit-to-bit clone of the drive because you're just trying to preserve the data. But if you're going to be using that in an investigation, in a trial, maybe at this time you would have to decide if you want to make sure that that data is preserved by a bit format or if that's not going to be relied on. As a CFE, the next step in my mind, or most likely the next step, is to figure out the possible schemes that could have happened in this organization. You may just have one scheme that was brought about by the vacation or the whistleblower, but in essence there could be various schemes. At this point in time, I want to examine the internal controls of the organization and see how I would steal money. I want to think like a fraudster and see where the money is, how can I get away with it? And oftentimes to catch the fraudster, you've got to think like the fraudster.
And Dave is very good at thinking like a fraudster. He practices every morning thinking of ways to steal money.
After 11 years, I go into clients with regular, accounting engagements, and I ask the question, how can, that person could steal a ton of money, and the question is, I didn't think about that. And that's just something over 11 years you get to often think, how would you take that money? I'll walk into a store and think, man, that cashier could make off with a ton of money, or it seems like it, or I'll go into some place and they're all using the same passwords. They're all, it's just a way of thinking after, CFA after a certain amount of time. That's how the person thinks.
Yeah, and invariably, based on that topic, invariably fraudsters commit fraud because they are well trusted and they have very little oversight. Invariably, people who steal money from companies are just not being watched and checked up on a frequent basis. And over time, they either recognize it or they decide that it's okay for them to steal, and nobody follows up on them. And it's trust and verify attitude in any business, whether it's a business or a nonprofit or a government agency. At the end of the day, your employees are there because you trust them. But in order to make sure that they're doing the right things, you need to be checking up and verifying their activities, that they're the right activities that you expect. After we have the discussion of scope and all these different areas, the next thing we're going to ask for is information. We want to be able to review lots and lots of data in order to be able to tie activity of a person back to transactions, and usually it's money that's been stolen from the organization. Dave, you want to talk about some of the electronic stuff that we look at?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to mention with internal controls, this is a good time to just mention that if those internal controls aren't in place, this is when getting that data may not mean anything. Take, for example, passwords. If 5 different accounting people use the same password, those logs telling me who did what really mean nothing. If everyone signs into the cash register with the same username, again, it means nothing. And at the end, you may have a nice report that says $300,000 was stolen, but in court, is that going to stand up? Or is the defense going to get up and say, how many people know your password? And then you're done. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, going through electronic data.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt you real quick
sorry.
there, Dave, and to build on that. And the key thing there is with controls, it's all about transparency and accountability. Who did what, and how do you know that person did that? And as Dave mentioned, if employees are sharing access to accounts or cash registers and you can't tie it back to a single individual, that creates an issue for prosecution, because the burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the individual who's defending themselves.
Thank you for clearing that up. That makes a lot of sense. The next, in that slide, going back to electronic data, I want to, as a CFE, understand what format the data is available in. What accounting system are you using? QuickBooks, Peachtree, Mass 90, Great Plains, and what format can you get it to me? I want to get that information sooner than later. I want to know if there's video, what format that is in, and what time frames they're available in. That's important, so I know how far back we're going to go, and to make sure that, again, the data is preserved. The next thing I want up, or probably before I actually get the data formats, is to know what software you're using, whether it's QuickBooks, Mass 90. Then I can figure out what audit trails are available, and then find out if you're using them. The other, another thing that to consider when doing electronic data is third-party data, whether that's banking information, investment information, any kind of information like that, as well as Word documents, whether minutes were taken in Word. I want all that information so that I can verify from the bank statement to the minutes to the accounting system, where did the fraudster slip up? in the minutes it says that the income was 10,000 and the banking says 5,000 and the accounting says 5,000. If I didn't look at the minutes, I wouldn't know that. So, where did the fraudster? I want to match this information and make sure that it all equals out.
Yeah, and I think that this is a good point to bring up. This is where the police can actually be very helpful. Filing a report with the police and an ongoing investigation can actually provide for access to information that you wouldn't normally be able to get, such as personal bank accounts and other information that the police can help to obtain that you can leverage in your investigation.
And even if you can get the information, a lot of times it costs a good bit of money to get the information reprinted or even scanned to a disk. And with a subpoena, usually that cost is not there. So that's just kind of an added benefit.
It's a value tip.
The next slide is similar to the last slide, but it has to do with paper. What things are still on paper? Most clients these days, especially larger ones, are going to be all electronic for the most part, but the smaller nonprofits, etc., are going to have more paper. And you have to make sure that that paper is organized and copied, and so that you can examine it. Just something to note. Again, it's getting less and less prevalent, but it's definitely a good thing to note and make sure that any paper documentation is copied.
And as we talk about information, whether it's electronic or paper, it's important to make sure that you either have original copies or copies of the information and that you're protecting it so it doesn't be destroyed. We mentioned earlier, when management is coming up with an approach and a plan, keeping the right people informed and keeping the wrong people uninformed is very important, because if the fraudster or the potential fraudster gets wind of what's going on, they might start destroying documentation they have access to. So one way might be that management evicts that employee right away and then does a fraud investigation, but then of course their advantage is lost by getting rid of that employee right away and not having the opportunity to interview them or allow them to make a mistake that might allow the company to fully prosecute them. Additionally, sometimes it's important to preserve records and the security of the company, and getting rid of the employee is the best approach. But protecting the data and the information that you have should be your first priority, especially if you plan on seeking compensation and possibly prosecuting as well.
One of the items I forgot to mention in the two previous slides in regards to electronic and paper data is the importance of getting any policies and procedures. Very important to figure out what is fraudulent as the organization. And as you can see, the first bullet point in this slide is a suspicious activity fraud? Or would the court consider that fraud? Or would a jury consider that fraud? An example would be if you have a policy, or if you don't have a policy, on the usage of company cars. And say 3 people are using it for personal use, but you don't have a policy that states one way or the other. Sometimes it's hard to convince someone that is fraud because you don't have policies and procedures in effect. If you have policies that state all travel should be business use only, it's very easy to see that shouldn't happen. Now, there's a whole bunch of different examples, but it's a lot easier if you have policies and procedures in place to say what can go on in the workplace.
Exactly, Dave. And this is a good point to remind everyone that if you don't have a policy within your organization about fraud, for example, then what's the expectation within your company? Obviously, most people would say, well, fraud is not allowed within the company. However, if you're not stating that expectation, if you're not telling people your expectations, then they won't know that it's really important to you. And by reminding people, it can be a simple policy that says fraud and illegal activity is not to be tolerated within the organization, and if you're caught doing this, you will lose your job. And then you have everyone sign off that they agree to that policy. That has a tremendous effect on limiting and reducing the amount of fraud that occurs in companies. Companies that have policies like that and re-sign them every year have significantly less fraudulent activity than those that don't address it or don't even acknowledge it. And it's important to note because it saves people money. I think we should spend a little bit of time on this last bullet point on this slide. What data and information can be relied upon in court? And this is really important because there are certain things that show up in court that can be relied on and certain things that just don't count, no matter how they may help to implicate or prosecute an individual. And fact-based information, the ability to trace back data and accountability and transparency of that information to an individual. There are all sorts of concepts within the courtroom, such as plausible deniability and reasonable doubt, and those concepts need to be recognized and addressed during the fraud investigation. If you can gather the information and it can clearly be linked in a reasonable way back to a single individual regarding fraudulent activity, then that's information that needs to be tracked, documented, and noted in a very specific way, which leads back to the importance of using certified fraud examiners and individuals who have the expertise and knowledge that can be relied on within a court situation. Dave, do you have any other comments on that?
One comment I would have to say is a chain of custody. It's important to make sure that when the data leaves the organization or the company that it's in the CFE's hands, and if it goes out of their hands, it's documented where it goes and make sure it wasn't altered, so that when you go into a criminal investigation, the defense can't use that against you.
That's exactly right. And I just thought of another term, burden of proof. The burden of proof lies on the prosecuting group, and any chinks in that chain of custody or the information or the data that may lead a judge or jury to feel that the individual, it could have been John Doe who's standing before us, but it also could have been Emma or Jane, because they also had access to the same information, and we can't really tell who it was. And if we can't be certain that it was one of them or all of them, then we can't prosecute any single individual in that case.
Interviews, I like to do those in two steps usually. I like to do the first section of interviews to those that are not involved in the fraud transaction. Now, a lot of times that's done one of the first steps in my investigation, so a lot of times I may interview someone in that step that it actually has to do with the fraud. But I'm trying to interview people that probably are not related. So I'm trying to gather information about the company, talking to management, how policies and procedures are handled, getting information about the different staff, just how the organization works. That's my first interview, and that's probably during the time where I'm developing what schemes could take place, etc. Again, just getting to know the company. After I get all of my data, my electronic data, paper data, I like to review all of that, come up with some assumptions, list some questions, and when I'm finalized and I can't go any further, that's when I like to interview the people that I believe are involved in the fraud. That way, some of the questions I can ask are sort of pointed questions and I already know the answers. That way I can keep the people on their toes and have a little step up. If I go in there and I'm just asking questions, they could be lying to me and I really have no idea. This way, they lied to me, I can kind of bring out the evidence and kind of set them on the straight path. So when I do ask those questions I don't know the answer to, hopefully I can get the straight answer.
Yeah, that approach is really key, Dave. Is having as much information ahead of time before you go into an interview is key to identifying and asking questions where you don't know the answer. If you can catch them in a lie and say, oh, well, you said that you weren't there on Friday, but we know you were there on Friday, and we have this evidence to show it. Now tell me about that Saturday. It's more likely to turn the tide in your favor during what is considered a hostile interview.
And during those hostile interviews, unlike the ones in the beginning where I'm talking to management, they're there to help me. I don't have to really become their friend in order for them to help me. In the later interviews, and I can use the data that I compiled so far, whether that was credit card data, whatever, that I could see where the money may have been spent, whether that was doctor bills for spouse, whether that was college tuition. I can kind of work my interview around those things and kind of become their friend and show that, I have some kind of sympathy towards, you had to do what you had to do, sort of work my way in there so that they kind of trust me and open up. So those are important things, and it's important to know why they did it before you have the interview.
Yeah, understanding their motivation ahead of time creates a great deal of leverage. If you understand what their situation is and what their motivation for the behavior was, it helps to build a rapport, and it allows the interviewer, us, to quote-unquote get inside the head of the individual and manipulate the situation in a way that will help to bring out information and even turn into a confession. We've had people who just break down and say, yeah, you know what, I did it, and I'm sorry, and let me work on paying you back. And those situations don't always happen, but they do happen, and they're more likely to happen when you understand the individual and why they're doing what they're doing.
And oftentimes that last interview will be the final interview with that individual. When they leave that interview, they're going to know that they're most likely going to be charged with the fraud, and you're probably not going to be able to ask them another question because they're going to go home and think about it, and it's most likely going to clam up. So you want to ask all the questions you want in that interview. And if you can, get a written confession. But a lot of times that doesn't happen, but you want to be prepared. If you're not prepared, this is one of the most important steps here, because a lot of times there's holes that, whether it's holes because it's cash related and you don't have any documentation. A lot of times with a confession here, it can make or break the case.
Yeah, and because these are such high value exchanges, we spend a great deal of time preparing for these interviews. We have questions, we have the approach lined up, we have information ready for reference. A 1 hour interview could easily have anywhere between 4 and 10 hours of preparation, not only between reviewing information, but just getting ready for the interaction with the individual. It's going to be a high payoff interview, and as Dave said, after the fact, they're probably not going to want to come back and talk about all the dirty secrets that they just admitted to when you had them in the first time.
Up to this point in time, that fraudster probably doesn't know he is on the hot seat. And that's a good thing. So you're going to sit them down, and it's going to be a shock to them, but you're going to use that shock to your advantage. The last thing is reporting, and I think Sam is probably the report master at this. He's great with documentation, etc., and I'm more into the technical details and how things work. But reporting is essential, and it's very important, not only for the client, the police investigation, but for the insurance company. If that report is written incorrectly, it's going to adversely affect how the payout is involved with the insurance company and how quickly the payout is done. You want to work closely with the insurance company throughout the process so that we're both on the same page. So it's important for management, but we're really writing this so that you can get the money back. I mean, that is our goal, is to hopefully make this outcome the best advantage. And since we're talking about reporting here, oftentimes we'll do different fraud investigations in phases. And at this point in time, it may be phase 1 report or phase 2 report. And we do it in phases because for clients, we'll give them a threshold, whether that's a $20,000, we'll work up to $20,000, and we'll provide phase 1, phase 2, and so on. At this point in time, it could be either or.
Right, and that limits your exposure. A phase 1 report will be, we'll do some preliminary review and investigation. We're going to look at electronic and paper documentation as well as your internal controls and processes, and give you our opinion based on that information about the best way to proceed given the amount of the loss, the type of fraud that occurred, the organization and the controls and policies and processes in place, and the information that's available for prosecution. And given all that, it may make sense to continue down the path for recuperation and litigation. Conversely, it may come to a point where we say the information isn't there, and unfortunately, it's a bad situation, and there's a low recovery probability.
Now, those opinions probably will be a phone conversation, because when you look in that report, it's going to be facts only. There should be no opinion in a fraud investigation report. So we're going to document in that report, this was stolen, John Doe was there that day. This, all the facts to provide an easy opinion from the reader. But they're just going to be facts. We're not going to say John Doe stole $3,000. He's guilty. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, and even though Dave just said this was stolen, the report wouldn't say stolen. The report would actually say this check was cashed, and this check from the company was deposited into John Doe's account. This check was issued from the company and deposited into John Doe's account. These checks were signed by John Doe. They were not approved by a supervisor. These are all facts, and then from those facts, a story can be woven within the courtroom regarding, well, was that because John Doe was underpaid and his supervisor said he should have that money and the supervisor is willing to testify to that, or was that because John Doe decided to cut himself some extra cash because he likes to gamble? And the report is strictly fact-based. This money went here, this money went here, here's how it went there. And then the story has to be woven later. And it becomes it's a splitting hair activity, but it's a very important one because there's other legal ramifications associated with slandering someone's character.
Danger of this presentation is you look at these steps and you say this is the way it should be. You got to remember that a fraud engagement is a cycle, and every time we have a change or something that we didn't think of, we're going to be going back to step 2, step 3, step 4. So it just keeps on being a cycle. We may get to step 5 and go back to step 2. So just remember that. And the second point, fraud events are unpleasant for everyone. The company is losing money. Not only did they lost $30,000, but now they're going to spend $10,000 to investigate. They may get that back in for the insurance, but it's definitely hard for companies because they're losing money and then they're spending money as well. But it needs to be done. And one thing I want to state here, now that we're saying that the company is going to be losing more money, it would be a lot cheaper in the first place to put those internal controls in effect to begin with. It's even you could put a complete camera video system in for the price of the investigation and still save the $50,000 that the fraudster took. So it's money well spent in the beginning.
I agree, Dave. Additionally, one of the biggest challenges, fraud is unpleasant for everyone. Not only are fraud investigations unpleasant and the fact that you lost money, but the reality is when companies experience fraud, people get really upset, and the reason they're upset and the reason they're disappointed and angry is because someone they trusted and relied on betrayed them. Someone that you didn't check up on or you didn't have appropriate controls over and you trusted them did something bad and they betrayed you. And it's unpleasant and no one likes it. And the reality is that if you trust everyone around you all the time, this is eventually going to happen. In small businesses, you can see this last bullet point. Median individual fraud loss is $50,000 for a small business. Larger companies, that goes up to like $100,000 or $120,000. Can your business afford that loss? Or would it make more sense to spend a little bit of time going over a fraud policy and making sure that all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed and that you're locking doors when you leave? Because even from our perspective, doing these engagements can be stressful. It's work that we think is important and should be done, but additionally, it's not necessarily the thing you want to do. It's would you rather exercise a little bit or plan for that coronary bypass?
probably the only person involved, or not involved here, but the only person that this is a pleasant for is your competitor. You know, you've got media coverage, you've got cost, and you've got your competitor being able to use that against you. So it's very unpleasant for you.
Now that you've heard all this, bad news and the unpleasantness, the good news is there are things you can do to prevent these. Hopefully, we've helped to create some awareness and open your eyes to what these engagements look like and the flow of the process and some of the things that you'll have to consider should you ever experience this. But additionally, there are steps to take, and the ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, has some steps. They have many articles. Feel free to check out their website. There's lots of great information on fraud prevention and fraud investigation, interview techniques, everything we've talked about today. There's more detail out there. But the ACFE says be proactive, just like we've been saying. Having good controls in place and policies and making people aware that fraud won't be tolerated and we're going to check up on you is a great way to prevent fraud and to save your company money. Have good hiring procedures. Criminal background checks don't catch everything, but if you don't do any criminal background checks, you will catch nothing, and you won't prevent the wrong people from getting into your company. Training your employees in fraud prevention, whether that's cross-training, telling them about a whistleblower hotline, encouraging them and empowering them to talk to managers when they see things that are questionable. That's really important, and creating a culture of accountability and transparency. I did this, and here's when I did it. That will help prevent fraud in a variety of ways that are immeasurable. Conduct reviews and audits of accounting. Hey, that's where your money is. That's what you worry about. If you're not auditing and reviewing those things, is it because you don't care? And I know the situation. We're all very busy, and there's only so much time in the day. But if you're not doing reviews of the things that are important to you, when things go missing, it can be kind of painful to be self-recriminating and say, well, maybe I should have checked on this. So planning on it now might head off that heartache later. And number 5, call in an expert. If you have questions, if you don't know how to set up your policies, or you don't know if the controls you have in place are right, applying some good resources ahead of time and getting the right people in who have the right knowledge can really help to make things a lot better within your organization.
I have to second that. I mean, if you call the people at the right time, you can really save your resources. And when is the right time? We're talking today mostly about when the fraud occurred. And I recommend this a lot, but in 11 years I can count on one hand how many times I've been asked to come into an organization beforehand to look at their internal controls to make sure that fraud is deterred as much as possible. Is it too early, or is it worth it to call in a CFE ahead of time and examine your procedures, internal controls? And I would say in most times it's 10 times cheaper to do that than the actual fraud.
Oh, exactly. And while Dave said, he can count on one hand how many people have called him in ahead of time, I bet you 100% of our clients who we've done fraud examinations for have taken our recommendations and comments about their processes and controls and made changes to make things better. And if a fraud examination takes us, 6 months and really is, 200 and 250 hours of effort, in 20 to 40 hours of work, we can come in and say, well, here's what you're doing well, here's what you could change. We're just going to make recommendations. We're not going to do it for you, but we can point out the holes. And once the holes are pointed out, plugging them up is a lot easier. But after all the horses are out of the barn, life gets a little more difficult.
Yeah, definitely involved in our investigation as a fraud occurs, that client, when we leave them, is usually, 10 times better off with better internal controls, etc. But, they've been, that cost them quite a bit of resources to get to that point.
We'd much rather hear about people who had plugged up all their holes than get phone calls saying, well, we think we're missing $120,000 and we need you to come in and take a look. Well, with that being said, we'll now take any questions that you have. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and except for questions about Dave's background in Special Forces, we'll be happy to field any questions you may have.